there are three main components of an argument. An argument has a premise, a conclusion, and support. Now, given that there are three components of an argument, one thing that you have to notice is that both premises and conclusions are always statements. And the support is the support that's given by the premise to the conclusion. With these in mind, there are two things that we need to consider when we evaluate any argument. Any argument must be evaluated in terms of truth-value analysis and logical analysis. Truth-value analysis determines if the information in the premises is accurate, correct, or true. Now remember, the purpose of an argument is to convince the listener or the audience that the conclusion is true by giving premises in support of the truth of the conclusion. So we need to know whether or not the premises that are given in support of the conclusion are actually true. This is what we do in truth-value analysis. We simply ask whether or not the statement, which is the premise, is true or false. And we determine the truth or falsity of the premise, the statement, based on whether or not it's actually the case that what the statement asserts is true in the real world. Logical analysis, on the other hand, determines the strength with which the premises support the conclusion. So in this case, what we're interested in is whether or not the premises that are given actually support the truth of the conclusion. We're not dealing here with whether or not the premises are actually true, however. We want to know if the premises were true, would they actually support the conclusion given? For example, consider the argument that we have here below. It has two premises and one conclusion. The first premise states, if water is made of H2O, then the moon is made of cheese. And the second premise states, water is made of H2O. Now, with truth-value analysis, we want to ask, are these premises true or false? Premise 1, if water is made of H2O, then the moon is made of cheese, is actually a false statement. Premise 2, water is made of H2O, is a true statement. So this argument has one false premise and one true premise. Now the conclusion states, therefore the moon is made of cheese. When we conduct a logical analysis, we want to know whether or not the premises given actually support the truth of this conclusion. So we ask ourselves, if the premises were true, would they provide adequate support for the truth of the conclusion? So if it were true that if water is made of H2O, then the moon is made of cheese, and if it were true that water is made of H2O, would those two premises, if they were true, support the truth of the conclusion that the moon is made of cheese? And the answer is yes. So this argument actually has good reasoning. It does have premises that adequately support the truth of the conclusion if the premises were true. However, it has one true premise and one false premise. So as a whole, the argument is not a good argument. Now, there are two types of reasoning that we can talk about in logic, and those two types of reasonings can be used to actually create two general categories of arguments. We have inductive support or reasoning and deductive support or reasoning. Inductive support or reasoning is the kind of reasoning in which the intent of the author is that the premises provide support for the conclusion being probably true. Deductive support or reasoning is the kind of reasoning in which the intent of the author is that the premises provide support for the conclusion being definitely true. Now there are two things to recognize about these two definitions. The first thing is that in both definitions of inductive and deductive reasoning, the intent of the author is involved. So with inductive reasoning, the intent of the author is that the premises provide support for the conclusion being probably true. And for deductive reasoning, the intent of the author is that the premises provide support for the conclusion being definitely true. Another thing to notice is that there's a difference between inductive and deductive arguments in terms of what kind of intent the author has. For inductive argument, the kind of intent is that the premises provide support for the conclusion being probably true. Whereas for deductive arguments, the kind of intent is that the premises provide support for the conclusion being definitely true. Now, these two different types of reasoning, as I've mentioned, can give us two different general categories of arguments, inductive arguments and deductive arguments. So inductive arguments will use inductive reasoning, and deductive arguments will use deductive reasoning. An inductive argument is an argument incorporating the claim that it is improbable that the conclusion is false given that the premises are true. A deductive argument is an argument incorporating the claim that it is impossible that the conclusion is false given that the premises are true. Okay, now notice how in these two definitions of inductive and deductive arguments, we actually have two components in each of these definitions that track the two elements of inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. For inductive arguments, we have an argument incorporating the claim. This incorporation of a claim involves the intent of the author. Furthermore, we have incorporating a claim that it is improbable that the conclusion is false given that the premises are true. This claim of improbability tracks the idea that for inductive reasoning, the intent of the author is that the premises, if they were true, would support the conclusion probably being true. For deductive arguments, we also have an argument incorporating a claim. The claim that is being incorporated is about the impossibility of the conclusion being false given that the premises are true. Now, the reason why deductive arguments incorporate an impossibility claim is because deductive reasoning involves the intent of the author that if the premises are true, then the conclusion would definitely be true. So here we have two different types of arguments, inductive arguments and deductive arguments, and they are differentiated by the fact that they use different reasoning, inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. However, in each case, you'll have a claim being incorporated, okay? And this is very, very important. The reason why this is very important is because there's a difference between a good inductive argument and a bad inductive argument, and a good deductive argument and a bad deductive argument. And what differentiates good arguments from bad arguments is whether or not this claim that's incorporated becomes fulfilled. We'll discuss this further later on. So for the rest of this lesson, what we'll focus on are deductive arguments. We'll discuss inductive arguments in further detail later on in the semester. Now, when we do a logical analysis of deductive arguments, in other words, when we are concerned about whether or not the premises given, if they were true, support the truth of the conclusion, what we're concerned with is the validity of that argument. So validity refers to the type of reasoning of deductive arguments. And when a deductive argument has good reasoning, we refer to that kind of deductive argument as a valid deductive argument. So a valid deductive argument is a deductive argument in which if their premises were true, it would be impossible for the conclusion to be false. Notice how a valid deductive argument is one in which the intent of the author is fulfilled. It's fulfilled in that a deductive argument that is valid is one in which it is actually the case that if premises were true, it would be impossible for the conclusion to be false. On the other hand, we can have an invalid deductive argument. It is defined as a deductive argument in which even if the premises were true, it is still possible for the conclusion to be false. Now, notice for an invalid deductive argument, what's going on is the intent of the author or the claim that's being incorporated in such arguments are unfulfilled. Remember, deductive arguments incorporate the claim that if the premises were true, then it is impossible for the conclusion to be false. If this is the case, then an invalid argument does not fulfill this claim, okay? Why? Because an invalid argument is one in which, if the premises were true, it is still possible for the conclusion to be false. Now, rather than truth value analysis and logical analysis, what we can actually analyze is the argument as a whole. Remember, truth value analysis deals specifically with the premises themselves, whether or not the premises are true. Logical analysis deals with the reasoning of the deductive argument or the argument given, whether or not the premises, if they were true, actually support the truth of the conclusion. When we bring both truth value analysis and logical analysis together, what we have is an analysis of the argument as a whole as being a good argument or a bad argument. Now, for deductive arguments, a good deductive argument is referred to as a sound argument. A sound argument is a deductive argument in which the reasoning is valid and the premises are in fact true. So notice how for a sound argument we have two conditions being met. All the premises are true and the reasoning is valid, so it has good reasoning. In this case, a sound argument gives you good reasons to believe in the truth of the conclusion. So if you have a sound deductive argument, then you can pretty much be guaranteed that the conclusion is true. An unsound argument is a bad deductive argument. So it's a deductive argument that either has at least one premise that is false, has invalid reasoning, or has both one premise or more that is false and has invalid reasoning. So there are actually three different ways in which you can have a bad deductive argument. Number one, at least one premise is false. Number two, the argument has invalid reasoning, but the premises are true. And number three, there's at least one false premise and it has bad reasoning. In any case, an unsound argument is one in which you cannot trust the truth of the conclusion. Okay? There's something wrong with that argument in terms of either the truth of the premises or the reasoning or both, such that if you have an unsound argument, you can't accept the truth of the conclusion. Now, there are several types of deductive arguments, and these are just some of them. So there are arguments based on mathematics, arguments based on definition, hypothetical syllogisms, and categorical syllogisms. We will be dealing with specifically hypothetical syllogisms and categorical syllogisms throughout the rest of this lesson and for most of the semester until we continue on with inductive logic. Okay, so argument based on mathematics are basically arguments where mathematical reasoning is involved. So 2 + 2 = 4, this is a mathematical argument. I have 3 apples, Jane has 4 apples, so Jane and I have 7 apples. This is another mathematical argument. The reason why these are mathematical arguments, again, is because they use mathematical reasoning. Arguments from definition are arguments in which the conclusion follows from a definition of a term that's being used in the premises. For example, consider this argument. Jason is a mammal, so Jason is warm-blooded. Now, the conclusion that Jason is warm-blooded follows from the definition of the term mammal that is used in the premise. So this is an argument from definition. Hypothetical syllogisms are arguments that only have 2 premises and 1 conclusion, and it will always be the case that at least one of the premises is a hypothetical conditional statement. We'll discuss more about this later on. Categorical syllogisms have 2 premises and 1 conclusion, which is what makes them a syllogism. And it's the case that all of the statements in a categorical syllogism are categorical statements. Now let us focus on categorical syllogisms for the rest of this lesson. One thing that I want to mention is that there are different systems in deductive logic. There's syllogistic logic and there's propositional logic. We'll be dealing with both of these 2 different types of logical systems until we get into inductive logic. Now, what I want you to keep in mind is that these are 2 different types of logical systems, syllogistic logic and propositional logic, and they deal with arguments differently, okay? So you can't necessarily use the same methods that you learn in syllogistic logic and apply them to propositional logic, and you can't use the same methods that you learn in propositional logic and apply them to syllogistic logic.